Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, back to learning with you. Welcome you all back. For those who are new tonight, welcome to the Shiur. We are going to do a quick review and a very short introduction, and then I'm going to throw you into Chavrutot, which is your opportunity to really learn on your own, which is part of the goal of being here tonight. So we are going to review a little bit of the Mishnah that we did last time. I'll quickly read it. I'm not going to pull it up on the share screen right now. If you have it in front of you, great. If not, you can just listen. I'm really going to review a brief overview. So we learned the first Mishnah. Our main goal last time was to learn how to take a Mishnah and ask all sorts of questions and realize that even though the Mishnah at first glance seems quite simple and quite understandable, when you read it and you think about it, you realize that there's really a lot of things that are not necessarily clarified. And the part of the point of doing it, first of all, it's just an interesting way to learn Mishnah, but it also sets the groundwork for when we get to the Gemara, because the Gemara is also going to ask all sorts of questions on the Mishnah. And sometimes it's interesting to think about it beforehand and anticipate what questions they will ask, which then sometimes they'll ask exactly the questions that you wanted to know. And sometimes they won't. And then you'll have to wonder, why weren't they asking my question? Isn't that also something they should have addressed? And that in and of itself is a good question. So I hope you had time. And if you didn't, I recommend, as I said, throughout the course, we prepared a sheet last week with all the Mishnayot of the Perek, of the chapter that we're learning, to give you an idea of how to do it on your own, ask questions, and that will also help us for our learning later on throughout this series. So we learned the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, I'll just remind you, we're on Daf Tzaditet Amud Bet, okay? Each page in the Gemara has two sides, Amud Aleph, which is the first side, and Amud Bet, which is the second side. So we're on Tzaditet, which is 99, 99b, and we learned the Mishnah. I'll pull it up briefly for a minute, and in fact, I'll do a quick review of what the page of Gemara looks like. So we have here a screen of the Gemara on the screen. We have Tzaditet at the top. It shows the page number. It has Arvei Pesachim, which is the name of the Perek that we're learning. It's the 10th Perek. I remember whenever I taught in high school, I would always grill my students on what chapter are you learning, what's the name of it, what number, because I used to say if the boys in Bnei Akiva or at Sofim start asking you, what are you learning in Gemara, and you don't even know what to say, what Perek, they're going to start laughing at you. So, right, part of it is you need to know what it is you're learning. We're learning the 10th chapter. It's called Arvei Pesachim. It's also a very famous chapter. And at what we have here in the beginning, it always starts off with a Mishnah. Today, we're going to get a little bit into the difference between Mishnah and Gemara material, stuff from the time of the Mishnah. So we learned the Mishnah, and then we're going to start today where it says Gimel Mem. That's the Gemara part. The part that's underlined here is what we're going to learn, and then we're going to move on also to the next page a little bit for today. So we learned the Mishnah, which said, Erev Pesachim samuch lemincha lo yochal adam ad shetechshach. So what we learned was that on Erev Pesach, you cannot eat until it gets dark. Afilu anisha b'Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyasev. Even the poor people can't eat until they lean. V'lo yivchetu lo me'arba kosot shel yayin afilu min hatamchoi. And they even need to make sure that they have 4 cups of wine. We discussed a number of different issues. I'll review a few of them very briefly, just as a lead into today's class or possibly also to future classes. So the first thing I wanted to remind us is why there's a prohibition to eat on Erev Pesach. So we suggested a few suggestions. If you remember, the Rashbam said that we want to make the mitzvah nicer. We want you to eat matzah when you're hungry. Give that example of going to a restaurant, right? You don't eat all day because you want to enjoy the food that you're going to eat. That's what the Rashbam says. But the Gemara gave 2 other explanations. One is either because we want to make sure you don't forget the sacrifice of the Korban Pesach. Pesach is unique, Erev Pesach. It's not like all the other Erev Chags because you have to bring a sacrifice that day. They would slaughter the animal. They would even roast the animal during the day, and then they would only eat it at nighttime. But they did a lot of the prep work during the day. So, and all the things that had to be done in the temple were done during the day. So that's number one. It's an important day, and therefore you can't eat because if you start eating, you'll get involved in your food and you'll forget to take care of the sacrifice. The other option is to say that it was achila gasa, that that's gluttonous eating, excessive eating. If you eat all day and then you come to eat the matzah at night, there's a special mitzvah of eating matzah at night. And if you eat that on a very full stomach, that won't count as eating. We talked about even on Yom Kippur, theoretically, you could eat a sick amount of food. And if you eat in that kind of manner, it's not even considered eating. So therefore, there's a special mitzvah to eat matzah at night. And if you eat that matzah in a way that you're not going to fulfill your obligation, that's a problem. So if you think about it, we have two kind of aspects that we discussed. One is that this day has its own special, unique nature to it. And that all has to do with the sacrifice, that even in those days, they called it a holiday. There was Chag Pesach and there was Chag Matzot. Chag Pesach was Erev Pesach, when you would do the Pesach sacrifice. And Chag Matzot was the 7 days where you would eat matzah. And that day in and of itself has special significance, and its temple, it's surrounding the temple, has holy nature to it. The other option is really just preparatory. And we all know when we think of Erev Pesach, we think exactly of that preparation. We're busy getting ready for the holiday. There's so many things to do. And therefore, don't eat, because if you eat, you'll get involved in your eating and you won't get to all your preparations. How many of us don't eat very much on Friday afternoons in general, right? Often we skip lunch or something like that because it's one of those days that you're very busy. So here they're telling you don't do it, because if you start eating, you'll get involved in a meal and you'll forget to take care of everything. So there's two elements to this day. One is preparatory, and one is maybe there's actually holiness to this day surrounding the temple and a holy nature. One thing I want to point out, that I had the privilege of attending Rabbanit Dreyfus this year on Wednesday night. She taught it in Hebrew, and she said something very beautiful about the poor person. And I wanted to bring it up. She said, and this also relates to the fact that there's sometimes, and often you'll see this in the Gemara, two aspects that we're discussing. And what she said is that Pesach has two different aspects. One is that we're supposed to be seen like we came out of slavery into freedom. We lean, we do all these things that show freedom. And that's what the Mishnah is trying to tell us about the poor person. He has to experience freedom even if, right, he doesn't feel very free. And even if he lives this struggled life, one night a year he has to feel free. But what she pointed out is that it also has the other element to it, which is we're also supposed to remember we eat maror, which is very bitter. And we also, right, and we don't lean when we do that. If you remember the matzah, if you know this, matzah is called lechem oni, poor man's bread. You're not allowed to eat matzah that has anything else mixed in it besides water and flour. It's supposed to be the most basic of the basic. Now, rich people don't generally eat bread that's just water and flour. And for the reverse is that the rich person has to view themselves as if they were poor to experience what it was like to be in Egypt. So there's two elements here which are also at play in our Mishnah. When we talked about who's responsible to take care of the poor, that the rich person has to almost envision himself as if he was poor and get involved and take care of the poor. On the other hand, the poor person also has to ensure that he has an experience of freedom, or she has an experience of freedom. So those are some interesting things we saw last week, and I expanded a little bit to give you something new to think about. And now I'm going to almost throw you into the Gemara. Before I do that, I want to introduce you to a few concepts and give you a little bit of an idea about what's supposed to happen during Chavruta. So the first thing, I'll go over a few of the words. Okay, I'll pull up right now the sheet and we'll go through the words on the sheet. Okay, so some of the terms, the words I'm not going to really go through, but the terms are very important. One of the things you have to know in Gemara is that there's terms. As soon as you see those terms, you already know what to expect. So if you see the term, for example, which we're going to start with, my area means, why is this particular choice of word used? Okay, why? And it's usually going to be a question, not always, but usually on a Mishnah or a source from the time of the Mishnah. Why did the Mishnah choose these words? And then they're going to suggest they could have said something else. And then they're going to learn something from, remember last time we talked about why are particular words chosen? They're going to ask a question that I don't think you necessarily would have thought of, but they will ask that question. Okay, the next one is Ditanya. This actually should be Vahatanya. Okay, we're going to see Ditanya. It's Ditanya, but also it's going to appear later as Vahatanya, which is Ditanya means that we learn in a Braita, which show, again, we talked about this last week. We have all different sources from the time of the Mishnah. In the time of the Mishnah, they passed down lots of information orally. And at a certain point, they decided we need to write these things down. Some of them were written down and put in a Mishnah. Some were written down and put in what's called the Tosefta, not to be confused with Tosfot that we saw last week. That's a commentary much, much later in time, about 1,000 years later. But the Tosefta was also put together. And then there's lots of Braitot. The word Braita, bar, means outside. So Braita means it's outside. It didn't make it into the text. So it's something that's outside the text. And ditanya means that we learn in a braita, but we're also going to see the form v'hatanya. V'hatanya is a stronger, and which is really what I wrote here, which is behold, it says in a braita. Now, sometimes you could say, and whoa, it says in a braita, and that comes to prove something. Or sometimes you could say, it says in a braita, you must be wrong. Now, there's rules when it comes to the Gemara, which is if you're living in the time period of the Gemara, which is after the year 200, which they're called, all those people are called the Emoraim. The people who live in the time of the Mishnah are called the Tanaim. If you're an Emorah and you say something and somebody says, but that doesn't fit with a braita, then you have to answer because you have to hold up to something that says in a braita. And as we learn, we're going to get to different types of answers you could use, but the braitot and mishnayot, anything from that time period always has higher significance. So if you ask a question, but it says in a braita, that always makes your question much stronger. Okay, 3 more and then we'll get started. Lo tzricha means, it's really like lo tzricha. No means no. And then it'll answer, it's always an answer to a question. And it'll say, why did you need this? And it'll say, no, you need it for a particular case usually. It'll say, this is needed for a particular case. Hanenile is saying what literally means these words. And what it's coming to do is to limit the scope of a text. So you might have something and then you'll say, well, it's only in a particular case. And afilu tema Rabbi so-and-so is always comes after somebody tries to explain a source and says it only seems to match one person's opinion. And then he'll say, no, I actually think you can explain it also with the other person's opinion. That's why afilu means even, tema means you can say. So it means you can even say, it's kind of a suggestion saying, I can even explain it, that this fits with someone else's opinion also. And I want to just point out that generally, if we have a source like a Mishnah and there's some other debate somewhere else, and we try to kind of work it out, sometimes we say, well, it only seems to match this person's opinion, but you might want to try to figure out a way, and that's why somebody's going to come in our case and say, afilu tema, you'd rather, if it fits with everybody's opinion, it's even better. Okay, so those are some terms. If you didn't get them all right now, it's okay. We'll go through them. Okay, I'm going to throw you into Chavruta now. And the first thing I want you to do in Chavruta is to take this section of the Gemara. This is the beginning of your Chavruta sheet. Okay, I took the words of the first section of the Gemara we're going to learn tonight. And I want you to try to learn it even without understanding right now. I want you just to kind of punctuate, figure out. I kind of gave you the structure. The Gemara is going to ask a question on the Mishnah from a Braita. So then I said, without actually understanding the question, try to figure out where the Braita starts and ends. Now, if your Hebrew is good and you can do this in the Hebrew, I would highly recommend trying the Hebrew, even if you don't understand everything. If you can't, then you can move to the English. I'll give you a trick to figuring out where a Braita starts and ends. There's one major difference, and this will be a little trickier if you're doing the English translation, and you'll see why in a minute. There's Braitot were written in Israel, okay? The main place where the Jews lived during the Tannaitic time period was in Israel. A few people not, but most people lived in Israel. All those sources, for the most part, okay, I would say 99% of the time are written in Hebrew. The Gemara is 99% of the time written in Aramaic. Okay, now I shouldn't say 99% of the time, but 99% of the time the Emoraim are speaking, or maybe 90%, they're speaking in Aramaic. So when they quote a Braita, now a Braita is always introduced by a certain word, like a Ditanya. Ditanya means we're going to learn in a Braita, and you immediately know the next word is going to start the Braita. How do you know where the Braita ends? So there's a few different ways. One is when the language switches from Aramaic to Hebrew, from Hebrew to Aramaic, then you know that the Braita has ended. If you start to see Aramaic words, you know that you've left the Braita at that point. Another way is to understand the structure of the Braita. Like often it'll say, there's this opinion and then there's that opinion. And when you're already done with that type of wording, and this will help you if you're doing the English. If you're doing the English, you won't be able to tell where it switches from Aramaic to Hebrew because you're only reading English. But you can kind of tell that there's a theme. And if, for example, there's a question, you'll kind of see, oh, well, somebody's answering after, okay? Another difference, by the way, is that the people in the time of the Mishnah, for the most part, are called Rebbe so-and-so. And most of the Amoraim, I will get into this in another class and I'll explain to you why, But most of the Amoraim that are Babylonian anyway, their names are Rav and not Rebbe. So if you see someone Rav, you also know that you're already in the Gemara and you're no longer in the Mishnah. So these are all tips. The other kind of tips when it gets to punctuating is keywords like Ella, which means but, all of a sudden, that must be starting something new, or so-and-so says, that'll also be potentially an answer or a question or some sort of word. You'll start to get used to figuring out words. So the first thing I want you to do is try to go through. I kind of give you the structure. There's a question, and then there's going to be two different answers. Who are the name of the people who bring the answers, and what words signify the beginning of each answer? So these are little tips you can try. If you can't get through it, don't worry about it. Okay, the chavruta here is really for your own sake to try to dive into things and try to find your way. If you don't find your way, it's really okay. This will get easier over time. After that, there's a series of questions. There's some that are more advanced. All the questions that are on the Gemara itself are regular questions, and all the other questions that are off of the page, as we say, which will be maybe a Tosfot we'll add in, or this time I added 2 other commentaries that you won't find on the page of the Gemara, but I brought them here. Those are all commentaries, and those I put as advanced questions. They're more in-depth, and but someone who's beginner might actually enjoy those kind of questions more. So you can pick and choose which ones you want to get through. And as I said, I will explain everything when we're finished. If you have a Gemara in front of you, you can use the questions on the chavruta sheet, but you don't have to use where all I quoted to make it easy for you. Everything's on the chavruta sheet. So you don't actually have to use an actual Gemara. But it's better if you can, and you do, but it's all here. And if you can do without the translation, try to do it without the translation. If not, the translation is here to help you. So I've tried to run this at multiple levels to allow all of you to have an experience where you're going to get something out of this at the level that you're at. And the last thing I want to say before I send you off to Chavrutot is do not feel obligated in any way to finish the page of Chavruta. I put a lot of things there, so that way if somebody has more experience and wants to get through it all, great. If not, whatever you get through, learn what you learn and learn it well, and don't feel like you have to finish everything. Okay, and I recommended this last week, and I'll recommend it again, which is anything you didn't finish, go back and do it during the week, and it'll be great review, and it'll help you learn the material even better. So with that, we'll get started with Chavrutot. Maggie, I'll pass it on to you if you want to say anything brief about the Chavrutot.